staple good. And the second thing, these anal stubborn policies of the government concerning runaway peasants. So they decided to change them into Kazakh areas to capture runaway peasants. Okay, and of course, runaway people didn't like it, and some Kazakhs didn't like it because peasants provided a cheap labor at the same salt mines. I didn't mention it. So a lot of peasants worked at this particular salt mine that was confiscated from this big group of Kazakhs that lived on Don River. So that is why we call them Don Kazakhs. There were different groups of Kazakhs. Okay, so attempt of the government to introduce monopoly on staple goods. What was the purpose? To squeeze the juice from the population, to squeeze additional money, additional revenues. Okay, why they needed additional revenues? To conduct this war. The chief goal of Peter the Great was to build up a huge, mighty army, armed with cutting-edge muskets, again, whatever models were made at that time, cannons. Okay, he wanted to build iron workshops to manufacture these things because Russia didn't have her own gun industry at that time. So his chief goal was to do this. Plus, he wanted to build military boats. Okay, another branch of this military economy that required a lot of resources. So he introduced monopoly on staple goods. Plus, wanted to put all peasantry that lived in Central Russian bondage, and to secure, solidify this bondage. No loopholes, no leeways. Okay, that is why military detachments were sent to in southern Russia to chase these peasants who tried to hide among Kazakhs. Okay, so the Great Northern War was not only a bloody war, but it exhausted the resources of Russia and Sweden too. So almost 20 years they were fighting each other. The war started about in early 1700s and continued until 1721. Okay, and essentially the major battles took place in the Baltic areas, and in Ukraine. Ukraine, what today we call Ukraine, and the Baltic areas. At first Sweden succeeded, but then there was a battle of Poltava. It's Ukrainian town, Poltava, 1709. During which Peter and this Swedish king threw a lot of resources, and formally Russia won, but it was a very precarious Pyrrhic victory because Russia lost so many people. Plus, interesting thing, chief of Ukrainian Kazakhs who originally sided with Russia, Mazepa. Remember, the Ukrainian Kazakhs actually supported Peter the Great against Don Kazakhs because Russian government tried to buy the loyalty of Kazakhs, giving them this privileges as a separate state. Okay, so that is why during this Kazakh/peasant revolt, after the salt mines incident happened, Ukrainian Kazakhs did support Russian government against these Don Kazakhs. Okay, Russian government was able to practice this policy divide and rule successfully in this case. But in this particular battle, Ukrainian Kazakhs didn't know who would prevail. At some point, Mazepa, the chief of Ukrainian Kazakhs, he believed that Charles XII, the Swedish king, could prevail. So he switched the loyalty. But the battle ended. I repeat, it was Pyrrhic victory, but formally Russia won, and this Ukrainian Kazakh chief turned out to be on the enemy side. Which again, the reason I'm mentioning, to show you that these incidents, behavior of Ukrainian Cossacks with regards to Don Cossacks, an attempt to sit on two chairs, shows that in the early 1700s we have this formation of separate identity of these people. So Cossacks and the surrounding people who lived in Ukraine, they started to shape the separate identity. See, they were not totally loyal to Russia. At the same time, they were not totally loyal to Polish-Lithuanian Kingdom or especially Sweden, because they didn't care about Sweden. They were Germanic speaking. Polish, at least, they were close linguistically. Okay. So we have the first sparks of the separate identity. Okay. And the Cossacks, eventually, they became the core, I would say, ethnographic group that gave rise to what later we call Ukrainians. Okay. Ukraine, by the way, is translated literal, something which is located on the edge. Or the area is located on the edge, a peripheral area. So that's what it was originally, because runaway peasants who escaped to southern Russia on the border with Polish-Lithuanian state, Crimean Principality, they were moving around. They were not serfs, of course. They developed this autonomy, sense of independence. It was hard to put them down, okay? And that's how eventually they became known, Ukraine, and people who lived on the edge, in the periphery, on the borderland area. Okay. By 1729, Russia eventually was able to formally defeat Sweden, although it looked like a compromise, because Russia never invaded Sweden, never. They just concluded a compromise, but compromise which did bring Russia territorial gains. Sweden shrank. Russia gained new territories. Particularly, we're talking about the Baltic area. Baltic area was seized by Russians from Sweden. Okay, and Peter the Great made 3 new provinces. 3 new provinces were added to the Russian Empire: Kurland, Livland, and Estland. Again, the ancestors, so to speak, of present-day Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. Okay. And to buy the loyalty of local people. Who were these local people? Descendants of these German-speaking knights who lived here. We talked about them. He gave them, he recognized the status of these Baltic Germans as aristocrats. So they were incorporated, like before Mongols were incorporated in the Russian aristocracy. And now Baltic Germans were incorporated in the Russian aristocracy. That is why we have the 3 chief groups. Okay, so Russian, Tartar or Mongol. Again, that's how Mongols were called in Russia, Tartar. Remember the origin of this word. Mongols and German, Baltic Germans. Baltic Germans. Aristocracy. Russian aristocracy. There's 3 groups, okay? And since these 3 areas and these aristocrats were highly educated people, especially Estland. Estland became Protestant area. Okay, this particular area became Lutheran, and Lutherans put big emphasis on the Bible, reading of the Bible. So education was quite widespread, and since a lot of Russian aristocrats and general population were uneducated, so and Mongol Tatars were equally uneducated. This particular group, okay, Baltic Germans, we have to highlight them. They staff the diplomatic corps, they staff the officer corps, they staff the governor's corps, the chief governors or military governors appointed by the Russian government in Siberia, late and Central Asia. These were Baltic Germans. For example, somewhere in a month, I think, maybe 3 weeks, we're going to talk, I forgot when we're going to discuss how Central Asia was conquered by Russians. And the person who was put in charge of Central Asia was Paul von Kaufmann, okay, military governor. He comes from old Teutonic family, okay, whose lineage goes back to Teutonic Knights, okay. One of the governors of Alaska, Russia, and America was Nikolai Rosenberg. He comes from old Germanic lineage who traced the origin of Teutonic Knights. In fact, from this family came Alfred Rosenberg, who became one of the chief ideologists of National Socialism, late Russian-speaking guy. Okay, this lineage gave a lot of interesting people to kind of contributed to the European history and American history as well, in case of Nikolai Rosenberg, who was chief of Russian America last. And I can name others, or the general who negotiated with, by the way, negotiated with these Kazakhs, Don Kazakhs, was, I mentioned his name, von Menem, Johann von Menem, also a guy who actually, before the war was over, he already jumped on the Russian bandwagon because many Baltic Germans believed that Peter the Great would be able to defend the aristocratic interests better than the Swedish king. Okay? So many of these people sided with Peter the Great. Again, another reason why these people loved the Russian Empire, fell in love with the Russian Empire, was that Peter the Great promised them a wide self-government. So he did not change, he didn't make any changes. They maintained their court system. They were able to maintain their language. Local universities were able to use German as a language of education. Local schools used German as the language of education. So he also, Peter the Great, gave them a green light to exploit local peasants, indigenous people, Latvians, Estonians, Lithuanians. That is why historically, before Soviets abused and oppressed and conquered these Baltic republics, the major hatred of indigenous Baltic people was directed against Germans. Okay, we should remember that this until 1941, 43, something like this. The major hatred was against Germans. Okay, because Germans historically were the aristocracy that exploited local indigenous people, and the Russian czars encouraged them to do it. They never objected to this, always backed up this aristocracy. Okay, that's essentially Baltic Germans became like this Praetorian Guard of the Russian Empire. Okay, that's what it was. So their loyalty was to the empire, not to a particular nation, ethnic group, but to the empire, because empire defended their interests. And last time we talked about this. Remember, I asked you about janissaries. Of course, it was done in a different way. In Ottoman Empire, it was done in a violent way. Remember, they abducted Christian boys, raised them as Muslims, and they performed essentially the same job. You know, they were diplomats, they were generals, officers. Okay, but here in Russia, it was done through kind of corruption of this class of people by buying their loyalty, okay, by giving them numerous privileges. So Russia replaced Sweden as the major northwestern power player. So Russia seized this Baltic area up to the Finnish border. Sweden was able to keep Finland, although the southernmost part of Finland was also seized by Russians. And many Finns started to sympathize with the Russian Empire because the Russian Empire tried to make inroads into Finland, promising Finnish people the same privileges And that's how eventually, again, I'm jumping ahead, I love to jump ahead. That's how eventually, in 1800, the Russian Empire seized Finland. Okay, because Finnish people were promised a constitution. Believe it or not, one of the most brutal empires gave Finland the constitution, self-government, postal system, monetary system. Women and men eventually received the right to do elections. Finland became the first country in the whole world which allowed women to vote. It's bizarre, it was still part of the Russian Empire. So the chief goal was to push the Finnish people to the side of the Russian Empire, to revolt them against the Swedish people. Okay. But we will be talking about it later. So these areas were seized by Russia, major gain. And that's when, during the war, to break this window into Europe, Peter begins to build St. Petersburg, which I mentioned last time. Okay. And he made the point that I'm going to build St. Petersburg on the land that belonged to Sweden before. Okay. So what we see right here. So this area formerly was part of Finland. Finland belonged to Sweden. So as a result of the war, Russia seized this area in addition to these areas. And St. Petersburg was built here. And St. Petersburg was built purposely as the capital of the empire, to challenge the Muscovite Asian tradition. That was the goal of Peter the Great. So here, in his imagination, European dressed bureaucrats would be working and walking on the streets that geometrically located, okay, against this chaotic Moscow, chaotic Asian Moscow. I did briefly mention last time how the city was built. I said that 25,000 people died. Mostly peasants, state peasants. Remember, state peasants were peasant serfs who belonged to the Tsar, to him, to the state. But Swedish prisoners also worked. A lot of them died. The job was done, the window was opened into Europe, and it was good for the imperial interests. St. Petersburg became like a magnet that attracted all the people who pledged their loyalty to the empire. It's Russians from Moscow who sided with Peter. Okay. Those Mongol Tatar princes or people who belonged to all the lineages moved to St. Petersburg. Baltic Germans moved. It became a multi-ethnic city. Okay. Since Peter the Great was the first to build up the Russian Empire, later Catherine the Great, whom we are going to discuss today, built a monument devoted to Peter the Great. Okay. So Peter's legacy, that's where we're going to end, and we will start the new lecture about the Catherine the Great. So he died in 1725. The first bullet point is very important here. Okay. Peter the Great was Western oriented, but the bulk of the country, not only the populace, grassroots, but also part of our aristocracy, they were Asian oriented. A lot of them got stuck in this Mongol tradition. So it was under his rule that for the first time Russian political culture, social culture created a schizophrenic middle ground, which to the present day affects the Russian mind. You know, if you want to penetrate Russian mind, okay, you have to understand this about Russia. Okay. So each country has certain mindset, a debate that informs the social, political, cultural life. Like you can find it here in the States, there's some kind of a major grade debate. You might want to identify this. But in Russia, the major great debate of the present day is, who are we? Are we Western people or we Asian people? Are we Europeans or we are Asians? They're constantly debating, attacking each other, smearing each other with dirt, canceling each other. For example, right now, under President Putin, an Asian party becomes supreme. So the present Russian government and much of the elite, they try to crack down on those people who are Westerners. Okay, so they try to shut them down from TV, from blogosphere, from internet. Okay, recently, that's 3 days ago, Putin's government said we're going to shut down YouTube, we're going to shut down Google branches of Google, YouTube. They have their branches in Moscow. But earlier in 1990s, 2000, there was an opposite. There was a lot of pro-Western sympathies, or pro-European sympathies. Okay. And that's how this debate is going. To the present day, his reforms are viciously debated and countries divided about him. Some people believe that he was evil. Okay, others believe, oh, he was good because he tried to kind of civilize this wild Russia. Russians are savages. And Peter wanted to civilize them, trying to drag them by the hair into the future. Again, I have problems with this kind of concept. I disagree with this because you cannot violently take anybody into the bright future. You invite the trouble if you do it. So George Bush tried to drag Iraqi people into the bright future. He thought they would accept democracy in 5 years. Republic didn't happen.
And it was even worse in Afghanistan.
Oh, yeah, worse. Yeah. But in all fairness, there were some politicians who, when the American government invaded Iran and Iraq and Afghanistan, some politicians, they were crusading against this. Okay, but the majority at that time said, "Oh, we need to bring a republic to Afghanistan and Iraq." And I was one of these stupid people, by the way. Seriously, I'm ashamed of myself. Yeah. So now I understand how stupid it is. But again, going back to Russia, still we have these debates between two groups of people, Westerners and anti-Westerners. Eventually,
Why is he called the Great if he's so controversial?
well, because his successors worked well, to give him this title. And Catherine, actually, primarily because of the Catherine the Great.
I think a good way to think of it is that great does not necessarily mean good. It just means influential. It just means big, right? And he was, a big figure, both figuratively and literally. And his legacy, as you said, still looms over the stage to this day. There was,
Yeah, that's it. I agree with this interpretation. Yeah, but the first person who started to use this on a wider scale was Catherine the Great, who built him this monument I just showed. And yeah, I think that's the reason, because whether you like him or not,
Yeah, Thompson, this is sort of going back,
that's how he explains it, right?
Like Thompson talking about Ivan the Terrible, that doesn't necessarily translate specifically to awful guy, but more, awe-inspiring, which, again, fair. Yeah, that's just how I like to think of it.
I still remember, I'm almost surprised the Russians took time to give him some variation of the terrible, considering you mentioned that modern Russians really don't Peter that much. I'm almost I'm just surprised they have modern Russians haven't done anything yet.
Kind of, as far as I from what I got from you right now. Yeah, part of the Russians who don't like Peter, I'm sure they're fascinated with Ivan the Terrible. Okay, that's how it works. Okay.
I'm just more surprised they didn't slap another title than the Great on Peter. Like nowadays, I mean.
So far they didn't. In the textbooks, so far he is under this name, but
Past a certain point, it's just inertia.
All right, so let's stop. It's about his son. Okay, so let's stop this and
Cancel. You want to hit cancel?
cancel. Yeah,
Yeah.
we don't need to shut it down. So as I said, we were expecting to finish our conversation about Peter the Great when you left. Just for you, remember? You might not catch it. And we are going actually in earnest to start this topic about Catherine the Great, okay? So just write it down, or if you have this title, so let's proceed. When a big name disappears, when authoritarian leader disappears in a country that is not authoritarian, and he doesn't or she doesn't leave a successor or reliable successor, of course the struggle for power begins. Okay. What happened under Peter the Great? His Palace Guard became very important. Palace Guard formed from Russians, Germans, and other people who were personally loyal to him. Some other foreigners from England with whom he worked. So they were loyal, and since after he was gone, they started to constantly interfere in the life to decide who is going to be a czar. Okay. See how the face of the Palace Guard changed. Before, under Sophia was the sister of Peter who challenged him in power, and he shot her down and shipped her away to a monastery. So she tried to use so-called streltsy musketeers. See, they were dressed in this Mongol type outfit. It's a kaftan. It's a Mongol dress. Okay, the head. Okay, the whole dress is kind of Asian oriented. Under Peter the Great, musketeers were eliminated. There was no streltsy. He wiped them out. Remember, their heads were cut. So no, they were phased out completely. Instead, he created Palace Guard, European dress, these guys.
What is that?
Huh?
What is that beeping?
I think it's my phone. I have to shut it down.
Okay, just as long as you know where it's coming from.
It's unpleasant. Okay. After he dies, 3 persons come to the picture to rule Russia. Shadow rulers. I will jump ahead. Formally, a person who comes to power was his daughter, Anna. Okay, but she wasn't a politician. She was surrounded by Peter's friends. Okay, and 3 major persons started to manipulate this woman, his daughter, okay, who took over. Alexander Menshikov, who was a common man, a vagrant actually. That's amazing, because Peter befriended him in German quarters, but he was Russian who tried also to survive, and he was hanging around in German quarters, and that's how Peter befriended him. And together they were building this mock army when he was still young. Okay, plus Heinrich Andrei, he took Russian name, Heinrich Ostermann, both in German, and Burkhard Christoph von Munich, a general, a military officer. So they viciously competed, 3 of these guys viciously competed with each other. Who is going to win? Who is going to exercise the chief influence? For 10 years there was this tug of war among these three people. Eventually, the fourth one, when these three guys were fighting each other, the fourth one showed up, who was lying low. Jochen von Biron, who comes from Estland, that's what today is called Estonia. He was able to sideline these three other guys, was able to buy loyalty of Peter's guards, Palace Guard, and stage the coup, 1740. Basically, it's a fight of personalities. Who has in this situation, who has a stronger personality is able to win. You know, because some people are by nature weaker, other people are stronger. So this person who was watching how these three major aristocrats were fighting was buying the loyalty of the Palace Guard in the meantime, and was able to come at the right time, at the right spot.
Are you suggesting that he was, that he had enough charisma?
Charisma. It's about
That he
charisma.
could attract people
Charisma.
and have them follow his.
Yes.
Yeah, that sounds scary.
Yeah, but some people have charisma.
Yeah.
Did you notice some people come into the room and they begin cracking jokes, something, and they begin to dominate a crowd, okay? They do it. They're very successful, you know? Of course, some of us have a strong personalities. We don't want to be captured, but majority of the people, they are opportunists, unfortunately. They follow somebody who has a stronger personality, okay? There's nothing wrong with this. That's how things happen, okay? For example, I myself, I'm afraid of strong personalities by being a person with a weak nervous system, you know. I cannot dominate people. I hate to dominate people. I cannot be in charge of something, you know. If you put me in charge of something, I will destroy this, you know, because I'm not this type of personality. But other people, charismatic, have strong nervous personality. They love this, you know. They want to be like deans, presidents, administrators, you know. They want to be in charge of money, you know. Just giving you this sample examples.
They want to be president of the university?
Who?
These kinds of people want to.
No, I'm just giving you an example. Maybe presidents of companies, yeah, president of companies.
Companies?
Yeah, company. Let's put it this. Let's play it safely. Yeah, president of company.
Who do you think's listening?
I don't know.
Both have ears.
As a result of this coup, Elizabeth comes to power. She was related to Anna. She was related to Anna by blood, so belongs to the same family. Since she was supported by Palace Guard, she wanted to placate the guard. She wanted to placate Biron, this guy who helped her to come to power. And she started to wear military uniform, dressing herself as a man. That was her favorite thing. And a lot of portraits survived of Elizabeth when she is dressed in a military uniform, riding horses, holding a musket, a sword, or something like this. Again, it's an opportunistic attempt to play on the military sentiments of Palace Guard. I'm one of you, you know, you brought me to power. And her nickname was Captain. Captain, that's how they called her. She and this Baltic German guy, by the way, who was German himself, they were afraid that there was so much influence of the Baltic Germans. They tried to balance it by creating the French connection. So this guy, Biron, encouraged her to make a peace treaty with France, to invite French engineers to start using French language, because too much German language, too much German element in your colors. We need to balance it, because he was afraid of competitors. So out. I don't want my own Germans to be around me, you know, because they're potential competitors. So let's invite foreign architects, engineers from France to balance what Peter was creating for many years. Remember this? A lot of engineers, experts, scientists were coming from German-speaking countries. So she was cultivating French culture, Elizabeth. That's when a peculiar tradition was introduced in the Russian court. It became cool in the Russian court to speak French. It became a court language. That's how eventually there were 3 languages used in the Russian Empire. French was the language of high culture, court. German language was the language of science in the Imperial Russia. Scientific books were published in German. And the Russian language existed for colloquial communication. Okay, that's how aristocracy communicated with plain regular Russians. Okay? 3 languages. To be elated, to be by the 1800s, to be cool, to be accepted in a high society, you had to learn French language. Okay? And of course, French language was a language of diplomacy, like everywhere else, all over the world, including the United States. It was the language of diplomacy.
The lingua franca,
Yeah.
if you will.
Lingua franca, yeah.
Right.
So to the present day, many documents are still by tradition are printed in French. Not many of them. Like half of them are already printed in English, because right now English becomes a lingua franca.
Wasn't French the diplomatic language up until about World War I or II?
Yes.
Yeah, I thought it was pretty
Yeah.
late.
But German, until World War I, was the chief language of science.
Still
So
is.
it was not an accident that in Russia it was accepted as the language of science, because not all books on science were published in Russian,
Yeah.
since major bulk of educated people came from abroad, from German-speaking countries, or from Baltic Germany. Naturally, all scientific books, like 80%, were published in German.
Right.
That is why some students, by the way, who specialize in Russian history, we had this funny, I would say, incident when some students wrote to me and said, "Oh, I would like to specialize in Russian history." I said, "Yeah, sure, you have to learn Russian, but by the way, you have to learn German too, because there are a lot of statistics in German. And if you want to learn something about high society, you have to learn French." So it's a hard job, right? Then, see, this period, I encourage you to just to learn about this period, but then I encourage you not to dwell too much on this. You know, this period since 1720s to 1760s, before Catherine the Great came to power, it was considered this a period of internal fight at the court. There was no stable power on the top. Constant palace coups. For example, at some point, as a result of a coup, a new czar comes to power, Karl Ulrich, raised as German, Russian, raised as German by these Baltic Germans, mentally unstable, bad manners, didn't speak Russian language. He accepted the name Peter III, Peter, Karl Ulrich. He lived in fact, not only he lived in Baltic areas, he lived in Germany, in Prussia as well, and he was fascinated with Prussia. At some point, he marries to Princess Sophia, a German princess, Sophia. I forgot what was her title. There were 49 Germanic states at that time. Germany was separated, so Catherine the Great was a German by nationality. She came from one of these 49 principalities. You will check up in your textbook which particular state, I forgot. So she got married to him, and she comes to Russia. She doesn't know anything about Russia, but she was 17. But she was so eager to observe Russian culture, Russian religion. So she totally appropriated this. Since she was young, it was easy for her. She learns language really well. She converts to Russian Orthodox religion. So she becomes just the opposite of this guy. So we have a German-speaking person absorbing Russian culture and trying to prove that I'm better Russian than you guys and girls around me. And we have a Russian guy who was raised as a German.
Like a lot of royalty, was he probably incest, concerning the mental illness thing?
Not necessarily, it just happens by nature. Yeah, of course, we can pinpoint particular men and women among European royalty who had either mental illness or there are certain plain illnesses like hemophilia. Hemophilia, it's a gene that traveled around in European royal families. All over. In Spain, it was caught in, I forgot what, 17th century in the royal family. Then in England, it was one of the offsprings he had it. And eventually Alexis, Prince Alexis, the son of Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia, who was killed by communists. So he had this disease, hemophilia, okay? So they were married each other, royalty, European royalty, okay? So it was not a surprise that a German princess comes and marries this guy, because all other royalty in Europe, they were doing this, okay? So she comes to Russia, she observes Russian culture, learns the language, and it was a very smart thing what she did. When he was still a Tsar, she was lying low. She was, of course, sidelined as a woman. She wasn't supposed to exercise, she wasn't expected to exercise any power, Catherine the Great. But she didn't waste her time, since she was, see another example, a strong personality, charismatic personality, okay? And plus, she was curious, like Peter the Great, who was curious, and she was curious in the same way. She was a voracious reader, okay? Tons of books. She knew French, of course, she was writing well in her native German, okay? Communicated in English, slightly knew English, and of course she knew Russian, could write, could read, and she wrote plays in Russian language, so she mastered it. Eventually, why am I telling you this? At some point, the palace guard that included Russians and some Germans, but major part were Russians. Okay, they started to sympathize with her because she's one of us. And this guy was hated because, oh, he is not Russian. Yes, we have some Germans among us, but we're still in this country. We expect, and it was also a matter of religion. He didn't care about Russian Orthodox religion. That was the major thing. Because at that time, remember, identity of people was defined by three things: where I live, place, what lord or emperor I belong to, and third major thing, religion. Okay? So race, ethnicity was not so much important. Okay? It was like not only second, but fifth or seventh thing, you know. Religion was a big deal. So since she converted to Russian Orthodox Church, she was very popular in the eyes of these palace guards. In the meantime, this guy tried to ignore Russian Orthodox Church. When he came to Russian Orthodox services, he openly mocked priests, laughed at them, because he was raised as a Lutheran. And it was very offensive to these people. So that's what, I don't remember if your textbook written by this guy Thompson mentions this, but that actually was the trigger. That triggered palace guard to kick him out.
Got a hand up.
Sure.
So that was the reason he was only czar for like 6 or 7 months?
Yeah, whatever period of time.
A little over 6 months.
Yeah, how many months we have here? 6 months?
Yeah.
Just about.
Yeah, 6 months. Okay.
6 months.
So, he was killed. He was killed by an ashtray. So during the coup d'etat, this Peter III was killed by an ashtray. At the same time, he was suffocated by a scarf just to make sure that he is dead.
I mean, beating him on the head with an ashtray?
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting.
And so Catherine the Great knew about this. She hated him because it was a forced marriage. Okay, it wasn't imposed marriage. She hated him. And she was craving for power because she felt like this. She was one of these people who just talked about people who want to become presidents, to be in charge of something. She wanted to be in charge. Okay. By the way,
Okay, did she like set him up like to be killed? Did she like set him up to be killed?
There is no official connection between Catherine the Great and the
Right.
people who assassinated her husband.
I like that you stepped in. Go ahead.
But if I remember correctly, she did pardon them afterwards.
Yes.
So clearly, regardless of whether she knew, I don't think she was very broken up about it.
Yeah. So it was like a formula. She couldn't say that I killed. I ordered him to be killed. But she pardoned this person who participated in this.
I think. I don't remember if that's true or not.
Plus, there was actually, it was in the court, this was a court legend that nobody knew what exactly happened with him. So there was a bunch of rumors spread around, you know, and she encouraged this. When you don't know what happens, it's good for you. People debate, you know, and at least there is no clear-cut evidence, okay? So, she comes to power, and the first thing she does, look, she felt insecure. Yes, she was supported by this palace guard, but she needed to entrench herself in the Russian Empire. What she did, her first act, unlike all other czars, czarinas prior to her, she issues a decree, liberty of the nobility. It's a very important, liberty of the nobility. I will explain to you. So first, we have it here. Don't be confused, because the first who tries to do it was Peter III. You can see it here, but let me make a correction. So Peter III was not exactly a bad man. Okay? He did issue this decree, liberty of nobility. And the fear of Catherine was that he could capture the sentiments of the nobles. So that's how we have this quick palace coup. Okay? She comes and she does the same thing. Okay? Let me write it down, because I want to make sure what we're talking. Catherine steals his thunder. Does it clear? Does it make clear?
Yeah.
Okay. Otherwise, you will be confused. Okay. And some historians believe that it could be the reason why it was so quick and why she tried to be quick with this coup d'etat. Why is it so important? Which Peter III tried to do, and she kind of stole it from her and made it her signature legislation, or not legislation, signature decree. Because, yeah.
So under the system that she continued to usher in,
Yeah,
the nobility was suddenly owning land with no.
right, exactly.
No
Nobility becomes the class in itself. So
Yeah.
they became the class that could control itself. They were not obligated to serve. Remember, the major thing was service to the state, to the Tsar. If you didn't serve, you could lose your land estate. Now, it's your choice. You can work for the government, or you can stay in your land estate, put your feet on the table and just enjoy your life. Just simplifying the whole story, but that's essentially how it was, okay? That is why she tried to act quickly, because she wanted to win the hearts of these people. And again, just to be over with this guy, as we said, he was anti-Russian, anti-Orthodox, and Catherine was opposite of him. He also mocked Orthodox ceremonies, confiscated church lands, so he was hated and she was loved in this case. In addition to her promoting this law, she totally opposed this. She returned the church lands. He constantly showed off that she was an Orthodox, making a sign of cross, you know, and all these things, giving land, giving peasants to the church, you know, so the state serfs were granted to church. Church was happy, of course, about this. So her years of her rule were 62 to 96, a long years. Her years became known as all the Russian history books as golden years. Golden years of our history. That we can put it in quotation marks. Golden years of our history. But why we should put this phrase in quotation marks? Because for whom was it golden years? For aristocracy. So since all history before 1917 was written by the elite, and elite was aristocracy, traditionally they use this expression, the golden years of Russian history. Although in present day, some Russian nationalists, they use the same phrase, and they play down her Germanic origin. They never mention, they totally emphasize Russian nationalists, present day nationalists, that she was Russian Orthodox, she was Russian, she was good, you know, and everything was fine. Although, see, formally she didn't belong to the ruling dynasty, right? Yeah, by blood she didn't belong. And she, to the end of her life, she felt very much insecure because the big deal at that time. So you had to be connected by blood to the royal family, but she wasn't. But I guess she compensated by doing other things. You know, a big deal was to conquer new lands, to support the Russian military, okay, church, of course, and that's how she compensated. Here we go. See, that's what I wanted to say, and I forgot about it. So, Zerbst-Dornburg, that's the place, a small principality where she was born. Zerbst-Dornburg. In Prussia. By the way, on Amazon.com, there was a movie, eh? What, did you watch Catherine? It's simply called Catherine, I think.
There's a show on Amazon called
Show?
The Great.
Catherine the Great?
No, it's called like The Great.
The Great. That's the show, I think, that's the one. Because I remember it was on Amazon, so if you have time, I didn't watch the whole thing, but I watched the first 2 episodes, and they really show well how she tried to wiggle herself into the Russian culture, how she kind of tried to learn language and things like that, you know.
At the end, they made her more of like a direct, like co-conspirator in like the death of her husband.
Ah, so they did this, right?
Yeah, like she essentially in the show, she like plans it out instead of just like.
Season 2 is coming out in a couple months.
Yeah.
It's coming, yeah?
Yeah.
But what did I watch in this case? I watched something.
I don't know, I was gonna look it up, I couldn't find anything, but this is like a comedy show.
Yeah.
Maybe if that sounds.
No, it's not comedy.
Hang on, I'm just looking
There are
at
a few. There are a
There was
few
a lot of
like
blood
that.
there.
Yeah.
Was it?
Okay, anyway.
Yeah.
Just go to Amazon and see this episode. If you have time, of course.
Was it Old Catherine the Great? Was that what the movie?
Maybe that's the one.
Okay, that would be Catherine the Great, the miniseries, which
That's what I watched,
which came out in
miniseries.
2019.
Okay.
Uh-huh. Yes, that's the one.
Yeah.
All right, I mentioned this, that, okay. She was interested in Enlightenment writers. Remember, Enlightenment was a big deal. She was dreaming about herself becoming an enlightened monarch. Remember? Enlightened monarchy. Did you read something if you studied some European history? Remember what is the major concept? Enlightened monarchy. So what does it mean to be an enlightened monarch in the 1700s? Okay.
Let's someone else.
Someone you don't try to monopolize it.
Yeah.
Who else remembers? Enlightened absolutism. You heard about this? It's an expression. It's a part of European political cultural life. And she was part of this. Enlightened absolutism. Who will explain it to me? Anybody else? Okay, so help us again.
Okay, so enlightened absolutism is sort of a weird counter idea to Republican government, like wherein like the ideas of the Enlightenment, like of rationality of the state improving the conditions of its people, instead of that being done through representative democracy, it is instead done through a monarch who is a very smart and very capable individual who has absolute power, and no one can say no to their programs that make things better.
Everything is correct except you used the word republic. I didn't quite catch in what context.
In contrast.
In contrast, yeah, exactly, in contrast, because it has nothing to do with the republic. Yes,
Right.
absolutely. Yes, what you said, please keep in mind, everybody. So it's basically an idea that a king or a queen should rule the state, taking care of the subjects by using the scientific methods. Okay, enlightened methods. Okay, by using science, knowledge, working to benefit the subjects, and the subjects should worship this person because this monarch was to be an enlightened one, and the uneducated monarch should not be in charge. So that was the expectation, that a monarch should be a highly educated person who uses knowledge to build his or her state for subjects to prosper, and that's kind of utopian BS, of course, but that's how it was understood at that time. Or enlightened tyranny in translation to original language.
She seems to me to have been a very smart woman who was not just book smart, but politically smart.
Of course.
And understood what she was seeing and knew where to press the buttons at the right time. So she was both legitimately intelligent and conniving.
Conniving, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, did you read this paper? At least did you browse this paper I gave you?
The one by Madriga?
The PDF, I posted in PDF, so anybody, whatever we didn't mention here, you might want to mention, so please go ahead, discuss a little bit. So anybody? Cool. Did you read? Yeah? No. No, who else? Okay, go ahead.
I don't know. I just want to say, based on what I've seen like Catherine, I kind of viewed her, like, with a little bit more, like you were saying, there's some people just believe that they're, like, meant to rule that, meant to, like, be in charge of that type of thing.
Charismatic person.
Yeah, I never really saw her as, like, charismatic, but more just, like,
Okay.
narcissistic, more just, like, she believed this in, like, her core, that she was meant to be, like, this person and no one else, and, like, so it just became, like, this perfect storm of things that happened where she could use, like, her, like, intelligence and her, like, her charisma in some ways, but I think like, she just had, like, I guess I just view her more in a way of, like, her, like, she came in a little bit, like, aggressive to, like, oh, I need to start doing things so I can stay in power, and she was really good at, like, playing mental chess with other people. Like, she was a bit more disconnected than.
So you're trying to say there was not much charisma.
Yeah.
There was more like a shrewd, she was like a Machiavellian person, yeah? A shrewd, like policy maker.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sort of saw her like pulling from Madariga heavily. It was like the idea of like, she was a master of the art of the possible. Like, she knew where she was coming from. She knew that she was this German noble from the middle of nowhere who had managed to, you know, get her claws into one of the most powerful monarchies in Europe. And, you know, she was a reformer. She did a lot of impressive things. But she was also very good at finding the line so that she didn't rock the boat too much. And then sort of going through the end of that, like her biggest flaw as a ruler, I feel like I'm paraphrasing a bit here, but like she could not imagine a world without herself. Because her son, you know, her son wanted to be put in charge. He wanted to, you know, be doing things, and he was going to eventually because, you know, Catherine is mortal. But she kind of shut him out.
Yeah.
And it didn't go super well for him.
Yeah, great. So I appreciate what you contributed because it allows us to kind of build up her complete portrait, you know, picture of who she was. Okay. Any other comments?
And it just seems like she's like the only essential employee in the country.
Yeah.
That's how she seems.
Yeah, employee. And she did fit Russian tradition. For example, in present-day Russia, there is only one politician. It's current President Putin, because other politicians are not allowed. There are no politicians in Russia, because if you try to become, you will be shut down. You will be ousted. It does fit the paradigm. Okay. So coup d'etat, we talked about this. I'm not going to stop here, so just I'm not going to dwell on this. Okay. Basically, her power comes from working for her class, where I mentioned the rights, privileges of nobility, the charter of nobility. Whatever Peter III tried to do, she actually decreed and reprinted constantly. This law was reprinted everywhere. It became like aristocratic constitution. Again, constitution in quotation marks, of course. A right to private property was not guaranteed before Catherine the Great. She did guarantee nobles the right of private property. So it means even her, Catherine, she could not confiscate anything from a noble, which was good. So it did flatter. Remember, there was a traditional pattern. Aristocracy was subdued as soon as the power became weak. Aristocrats tried to grab as much power as possible. It was constant tug over. Now, there was no more tug over anymore. I guarantee you, you'll end the states. Even if I, Catherine the Great, want to take it from you, I cannot do it unless you involve in the politics, because she didn't allow nobles to be involved in the politics. And she actually shut down one of the nobles. His name, I don't mention him here. He is a Russian noble. His name is Nikolai Radishchev. Nikolai Radishchev. He wrote a book called A Travel from St. Petersburg to Moscow. A Travel from St. Petersburg to Moscow, where he criticized nobles' treatment of peasant serfs. He said, in other countries, they don't have serfdom. Look at England, look at France. Okay, they don't have serfdom. Peasants don't belong to anybody. How can we own human beings? She immediately shut him down. She didn't confiscate his land estate because charter of nobility, you have your private property, but she exiled him into his land estate, and basically he was put under house arrest because he was a subversive element, dangerous. She also gave some limited rights to towns, of course not so many privileges like she had given to nobles, but some rights to towns to elect the mayors. Before it was never practiced to elect mayors. The exception of the Novgorod Republic, of course. She was actually the first person to launch a Russian system of public education, which never existed before. She started schools in towns for burghers, not for peasants, for burghers, not for countryside. First school for women aristocrats, so-called small institute in St. Petersburg. Because before Catherine, it was expected that women should not get education. Period. That's how it was done in Russia. A very traditional country. Okay? This Mongolian tradition was inherited. And she broke away from this tradition. She reformed the empire. Peter the Great died when he was about to do it. He didn't complete it. And of course, during this period of games in the court, the struggle for power, it was never done. She divided entire Russia into provinces and assigned governors to each province. So which meant administrative division. Each governor had to report to her to collect revenues, and everything was done in a kind of efficient, Germanic efficient way. Okay. Unfortunately, the last bullet point is very important. So she was the one that she allowed landlords to sell peasants without land. It was done before on a limited scale, but it was not approved by public opinion. It was bad in the eyes, even fellow aristocrats, to sell your peasants without land. So if you want to trade your peasants, you could lose your peasants by playing cards. Yes, there were, yes. But there were incidents before Catherine the Great when peasants were lost in the card game, but with land. So the person who lost in the game, he gave peasants with land. Now she allowed the landlords to sell people without land. So it means serfdom turned into slavery. Okay, that's what it was. So the last bullet point is very important. So half of the peasants, remember, were peasants who belonged to landlords. They became slaves. The other half were state peasants who belonged to her, to the state.
So she was only great for the nobility.
Yes. That's the source of
She wasn't so great for serfs or peasants.
Absolutely not.
Yeah. Okay.
So, but the peasants aren't writing the history books, are they?
Right, exactly.
No, it's the textbook companies that write the history.
All right, so that's what we need to remember about her. So she did contribute to some, she did develop her empire, contributed to her class that backed her up, but she was vicious. I'm using modern day word, oppressor with regards to peasants. Okay, so let's stop at this point. Okay, I don't want again to take much of your time, I think, yeah, time is up. Whatever remains, maybe bits of pieces we will discuss next time. And don't forget to go to e-courseware, I will show you study guides.
Mhm.
Yeah.